The morning my entire family turned on me, it was raining. Not a dramatic storm. Not the kind of downpour that feels like the universe is setting a scene. Just a gray, quiet Tuesday drizzle, the kind that fogs up car windows and makes everything outside look slightly out of focus. Which felt appropriate because that's exactly what my life had become. I was sitting in a leather chair across from a man I'd never met before that day. His name was Gerald Whitmore, and he was my grandfather's attorney. He had silver hair, wire-rimmed glasses, and the kind of calm expression that told me he'd seen a lot of families fall apart in rooms exactly like this one. My mother was 2 seats to my left. My Aunt Patricia was beside her. My Uncle Darren was standing near the door, arms crossed, jaw tight, the way he always stood when he was trying to look like he was in charge of something. They had all been smiling when we walked in. That smile disappeared about 40 seconds after Gerald opened his mouth. Because what he said next, the thing he read from a document none of them had ever seen, made my mother's face go white. Made Patricia grab the armrest so hard her knuckles went pale. Made Darren actually step forward like he was going to physically stop what was happening. But he couldn't. None of them could. The number Gerald read into that room changed everything. Not just financially. Not just legally. Changed who I understood myself to be, who my grandfather had believed I was, and it exposed in front of everyone exactly what my family had spent 15 years trying to make me forget. But before I tell you how everything fell apart, you need to know how it started. My name is Marcus Ellery, and I grew up in a house where love was distributed like a limited resource. Not equally. Not generously. But carefully, strategically, in a way that kept certain people feeling chosen and others feeling like they were always one wrong move away from being cut off entirely. I was the second child. Quieter one. The one who read too much and talked too little, according to my mother. She used to say it as a complaint, "Marcus, you're always off somewhere in your head," like curiosity was a character flaw she hadn't been able to breed out of me yet. My older brother, Colton, was the one she'd been able to breed correctly. He was louder, more charming, quicker with a smile. He played 3 sports. He got average grades but made friends effortlessly. He was the kind of kid who walked into a room and made adults feel comfortable, and in our family that was the highest possible achievement. My father, Robert Ellery, worked in commercial real estate and measured people mostly by what they could produce. He wasn't cruel, I want to be clear about that. He wasn't the villain of my childhood. He just wasn't very present. He showed up to Colton's games more than mine. He remembered Colton's friends' names. He asked Colton questions about his future with a kind of bright-eyed investment he never quite found when looking at me. I told myself it didn't matter. I got good at telling myself things didn't matter. What did matter, what truly mattered to me as a kid and as a teenager and honestly into my 20s, was my grandfather. Elias Ellery. My father's father. The man who built the family's original wealth through 60 years of discipline, sacrifice, and a level of integrity that seemed almost old-fashioned by the time I was old enough to understand it. Grandpa Elias was different with me. He noticed things about me that nobody else bothered to notice. He'd ask what I was reading and then actually wait for the answer. He taught me chess when I was 7, not because he wanted me to win, but because he wanted me to learn how to think 3 moves ahead. He took me fishing every summer until I was 16. He showed up to things nobody else showed up to: my school science fair, my debate team competitions, a community theater production I did freshman year of high school where I played a talking tree and forgot half my lines. He was in the front row. He clapped the loudest. I graduated from State University with a degree in business administration at 23. No fanfare. Colton had graduated the year before with a finance degree, and the family had thrown him a party that required catering and a rented venue. For mine, we went to Applebee's. 7 people, 1 booth, and my mother spent most of the meal on her phone. I got a job at a mid-sized logistics company, worked my way up to a project management role over 5 years, and built a decent life. I had an apartment I was proud of. A small savings account. A few good friends. A woman named Dana who I'd been dating for 2 years and was starting to think seriously about. I wasn't wealthy. I wasn't flashy. But I was okay. I had learned to be okay with okay. And then, 6 months before my grandfather turned 80, something shifted. Something I couldn't quite name at the time. A slight change in the atmosphere at family dinners. A certain way my mother would glance at my Uncle Darren when she thought I wasn't watching. A new kind of quiet that settled over conversations whenever Grandpa Elias's health came up. I didn't know what it meant yet, but something in my gut told me to pay attention. The first sign I dismissed was a phone call I wasn't supposed to hear. It was Thanksgiving. I'd arrived early to help Grandpa Elias. He was living in the house he'd owned for 40 years on the east side of town, and he'd started needing a little more help getting meals together. I didn't mind. I came early every holiday. It was something between us that nobody else bothered with. I was in the kitchen when I heard my mother and Aunt Patricia talking in the hallway. Their voices were low, but the house was old and sound traveled strangely through those walls. "He needs to update it," my mother said. "He's not going to do it voluntarily," Patricia said back. "Then someone needs to guide him. He trusts certain people more than others. That's all I'm saying." I didn't know what it was. I assumed they were talking about his will in the vague, abstract way families start talking about these things when a parent gets older. I didn't like the tone of it, but I filed it away and went back to stirring the gravy. That was my first mistake. The second sign came in February. Grandpa Elias called me on a random Wednesday night, unusual because he typically texted, which was something that had always made me smile, the idea of this 80-year-old man learning to use his phone just to stay close to the people he loved. But he called this time. His voice was measured. Careful. "Marcus," he said, "I want you to know something. Whatever anybody tells you about the future, I need you to trust that I made choices I believe in. Will you trust that?" I said, "Of course, Grandpa." He said, "Good." That was it. He moved on to asking about Dana. We talked for another 20 minutes about nothing in particular. But that one statement sat in my chest like a stone for weeks. Whatever anybody tells you about the future. What was somebody going to tell me? The third sign was the worst because it wasn't subtle at all. I just convinced myself it was nothing because I didn't want it to be something. It was a Sunday dinner at my parents' house. Colton was there with his wife, Bree. My Uncle Darren and Aunt Patricia came with their son, Tyler, who was 20 and already being talked about in my family like he was some kind of financial prodigy because he'd done 1 semester of economics at a state school. After dinner, I went to get my jacket from the office where everyone had piled their coats. The door was half open. My father and Uncle Darren were inside, and they stopped talking the exact moment I pushed the door open. Just stopped. Mid-sentence. Darren actually took a step back from my father, as if creating distance would make the scene look more casual. "Marcus," my father said. "Heading out." "Yeah," I said. Early morning. I grabbed my jacket. I left. In my car, I sat for a full minute before starting the engine. They had stopped talking because of me. Not because the conversation was over. 'Cause I had arrived. I drove home telling myself it was nothing. But that's the thing about red flags, they're only red in hindsight. In the moment, you're too busy hoping you're wrong to let yourself actually see them. And then, 11 days later, I got a phone call that made every single one of those moments snap into terrifying focus. The call came from a number I didn't recognize. I almost let it go to voicemail. "Mr. Ellery?" The voice was professional. Clipped. "My name is Sandra Cho. I'm a paralegal at Whitmore and Associates. I'm calling on behalf of Elias Ellery. He's asked me to reach out to you directly." I pulled over. I don't know why I pulled over. I wasn't driving dangerously, wasn't going fast. But something in the formality of her voice made me feel like I needed to be stationary for whatever was coming. "He's asked us to inform you that certain arrangements have been made," she said. He'd like you to come in at your earliest convenience to review some documentation. Is he okay? I asked. Is something wrong with his health? He's stable, she said. This is a planning matter. He was very specific that you come in alone, and that you not mention this call to other family members at this time. Alone. Don't mention it to other family members. My heart was doing something strange. Not racing exactly, more like stuttering. Like it couldn't find its rhythm. I went in the following Thursday. The office was downtown. Clean, quiet, the kind of place that cost money to maintain. Sandra Cho met me at the front desk and walked me back to a conference room where a man was already seated, Gerald Whitmore himself. Silver-haired. Wire-rimmed glasses. The man I would meet again months later in that same room with my family present when everything finally came apart. He shook my hand. Offered me water. Sat down. Your grandfather has been a client of ours for 31 years, Gerald said. He's a deliberate man. He doesn't do things without reason, and he doesn't make decisions without thinking them through very carefully. I want you to understand that context before I show you anything. He slid a folder across the table. I opened it. First page was a trust document. The language was dense, legal phrasing I had to read twice to parse, but the structure became clear quickly. My grandfather had established a revocable living trust 20 years ago. Standard enough. But what wasn't standard was what I was reading in the amendment section near the back of the folder. An amendment dated 8 months ago. Signed, witnessed, and notarized. My name appeared in it more times than I could count on one hand. He updated this after a conversation the two of you had, Gerald said. He told me you reminded him of himself when he was young. He said, and I'm quoting directly because I wrote it down, Marcus never asks me for anything. That's why he gets everything. I had to read that sentence 3 times. I don't understand, I said. Your grandfather's primary estate, the house, the investment accounts, the business holdings he never fully divested, totals approximately $4.3 million. Gerald folded his hands. Under the updated trust, you are the primary beneficiary. 60%. The remaining 40% is distributed among a charitable foundation he established and a small number of individual bequests. The room went very quiet. My father, I said. My uncle. My brother. Are not named in the trust, Gerald said. Correct. I sat back. He knew they'd fight it, I said. It wasn't a question. Gerald nodded slowly. He anticipated it, which is why the amendment process was conducted with exceptional care. Witnesses unrelated to the family. Full cognitive evaluation on record. Documented consultations across 6 months. He paused. He wanted it to hold. I left that office in a daze. And that night my grandfather called me. Not to explain. Not to apologize for the weight he'd just placed on me. Just to say, I watched you for a long time, son. I paid attention. I hope you know that. I told him I did. I didn't sleep that night. Because I knew, even then, sitting alone in my apartment at 2 a.m, that the moment this became public, my family would not accept it. They would fight it. They would lie. They would come for me in ways I hadn't prepared for. I had no idea how right I was. Grandpa Elias passed away 14 weeks later. Quietly, in his sleep, in the house he'd lived in for 40 years. My father called me at 6 a.m, and I already knew before he said the words. The funeral was handled. The grief was real. Whatever else was coming, I had genuinely lost someone I loved. But within 72 hours of the burial, my mother sat me down at the kitchen table and told me something that made my blood go cold. Your grandfather left everything to a charity, she said. The attorney confirmed it. There's nothing for any of us individually. I just wanted you to hear it from me first. She looked me directly in the eyes when she said it. I kept my face neutral. That's his choice to make, I said. She nodded slowly, the way you nod when you're checking whether a lie landed. It had. She thought it had. What I didn't say was, I've already been to that attorney's office. I've already read the trust. And I know exactly what you're doing right now. The next 2 weeks were a masterclass in manipulation. My Uncle Darren called me 3 times. Casual calls on the surface, checking in how was I doing, wasn't it such a loss, but each one drifted toward the same territory. Had I talked to Gerald Whitmore? Did I know anything about the estate? He'd heard there might be some complications with the filing and he was just making sure everyone had the right information. I said I didn't know much, that I was still processing. He seemed satisfied by that. Then came the family dinner. My mother organized it 2 weeks after the funeral, framed as a coming together, family grief, support, togetherness. She made pasta. She lit candles. She hugged everyone twice when they came in. Halfway through dinner, my father cleared his throat and said, "We've been talking as a family, and we think it makes sense for all the grandchildren to receive something equal from whatever's left in the estate. Out of fairness." He looked at me when he said fairness. "Equal shares," Colton added, nodding. "Just makes sense." "Grandpa would have wanted that," Aunt Patricia said. "He loved all his grandchildren." I looked around the table. My cousin Tyler was staring at his plate. At least he had the decency to look slightly uncomfortable. "I think we should let the estate process play out," I said carefully. "Let the attorney do his job." Table went quiet. "Of course," my mother said too quickly. "Of course. That's all we're saying. We just want to be sure everyone's protected." I smiled. I helped clear the plates. But that wasn't the worst part of that night. The worst part was afterward in the driveway when my mother pulled me aside while everyone else was still inside, and looked at me with this particular expression she has, soft eyes, slightly tilted head, that she uses when she's about to deliver something she's decided sounds like love but isn't. "Marcus," she said, "I need you to understand something. Your grandfather was not in the best state of mind toward the end. You know that. We all know that. And if there's a document somewhere that doesn't reflect his true wishes, his real wishes when he was fully himself, it would be wrong to honor it. It would be a disservice to who he was." I stared at her. She was telling me, carefully, gently, with that soft tilt of her head, that she was going to claim my grandfather was not competent when he made his decisions. That she was going to use his death as a tool to rewrite his choices. "I hear you," I said. I walked to my car. I sat in the dark for a moment. Then I picked up my phone and texted Gerald Whitmore, "We need to talk this week." "They're going to contest." His reply came within minutes. "We expected this. Everything is ready. Call me tomorrow morning. I need to be honest about who I was in the weeks that followed. I was not calm. I was not some composed protagonist who knew exactly what to do and moved through events with quiet confidence. I was scared. I was angry in the slow-burning way that keeps you up at 3 in the morning staring at the ceiling, running through conversations you didn't handle well enough. I second-guessed myself constantly. But I also got to work. Gerald walked me through the legal protection already in place, the cognitive evaluation, the witness documentation, the meticulous paper trail my grandfather had apparently been building for the better part of a year. He knew his family, Gerald told me. He didn't want there to be any ambiguity that could be exploited. But Gerald also made clear that even airtight documents could be challenged. Challenges cost time, money, and emotional bandwidth. We needed to be prepared. So I started preparing. I went back through my phone and documented every conversation I could find. Every text from my Uncle Darren asking about the estate. Every voicemail I'd saved out of instinct. I had a habit, one Dana always teased me about, of never deleting voicemails. I kept them in a folder I'd labeled Save for no particular reason. Looking through it now, I found things I hadn't consciously remembered saving. A message from my mother from 8 months ago before Grandpa passed, where she mentioned almost in passing that she'd been talking to someone about the estate situation. A message from Darren where he referenced a plan for handling the inheritance without elaborating. Screenshots. Timestamps. Organized by date in a folder on my phone and backed up to the cloud twice. I hired my own attorney, separate from Gerald, someone who specialized in contested estate litigation. Her name was Dr. Veronica Hall, and she was one of those people who is physically small and professionally enormous. She wore reading glasses, she was always slightly pushing up her nose, and she had a habit of writing notes in the margins of documents with a red pen, which she wielded like a scalpel. "Walk me through your family's financial situation," she said in our first meeting. I did. All of it. My parents' mortgage situation. The fact that my Uncle Darren's business had gone through a rough stretch 2 years ago. The way conversations about Grandpa's health had always taken on a certain financial undertone that I'd tried to ignore. "So they need the money," she said simply. "I think they expected it," I said. "I don't know how much they need it." "It doesn't matter," she said. "What matters is that they feel entitled to it. Entitlement is more dangerous than need." She was right. I also did something nobody in my family would have expected of me. I went to visit 2 of my grandfather's oldest friends, men he'd known for decades, who had been present in his life in ways my family hadn't bothered to understand. One of them, a man named Clarence who'd played chess with my grandfather every other week for 30 years, told me without prompting that Elias had spoken to him extensively about his estate decisions. That he'd been very deliberate and very clear-eyed in the months before his death. That he'd said, and Clarence remembered this specifically, "I'm not leaving my life's work to people who are waiting for me to die." I asked Clarence if he'd be willing to put that in writing. He said he'd been waiting for someone to ask. I didn't tell anyone in my family what I was doing. I let them think I was grieving quietly. I let them think I was passive. I let them think whatever they needed to think. Because the moment they knew I was ready, the moment they understood what I'd built, this whole thing would play out differently. And I needed it to play out on my terms. My phone buzzed. Text from Colton, "Hey. Mom says we're all meeting at the house Saturday. Family stuff. Be there." I stared at the text for a long moment. Family stuff. I typed back, "I'll be there." I didn't know yet exactly what Saturday would bring. But I was starting to understand that whatever it was, I wouldn't be walking in unprepared. Saturday arrived cold and overcast. I got to my parents' house at noon, exactly when my mother had said. My father's car was in the driveway along with Darren's SUV and Patricia's sedan. Colton's truck. Even Tyler's beat-up hatchback. They were all already inside. They were all already seated. That told me something right away. I was the last to arrive, not by accident. I was supposed to walk into a room that was already arranged. A dynamic already established. A table already set. I walked in anyway. My mother came to the door with a smile and a hug that lasted slightly too long. She smelled like her usual perfume, and underneath it, something else, a tightness, a performance of warmth that didn't quite reach her eyes. The living room had been rearranged. Not dramatically, but enough. Chairs pulled into a loose circle like a meeting. Like a deliberate configuration. I sat down. My father didn't waste time. "We've had a conversation with an attorney," he said. "Not Whitmore, someone else. And based on what we've been told, there are serious questions about the validity of certain documents your grandfather may have signed near the end of his life." I said nothing. "He was on medication," my mother added softly. 3 different medications in his last year. There's reason to believe his decision-making was compromised. "And there's a process," Darren said, leaning forward, "to address that. Legally. It's not about fighting anyone. It's about making sure the right outcome happens." "The outcome Dad would have wanted," Patricia said. I looked around the circle. "What outcome is that?" I asked. Equal distribution, my father said. Among family. The way it should have been. There's a document, my mother said carefully, that Darren's attorney found. A letter. From your grandfather. Written years ago before all of this, where he talked about treating his grandchildren equally. That letter establishes intent. Prior intent. I looked at her. Can I see the letter? I said. A pause. Brief but unmistakable. You'll see it when the time comes, Darren said. That pause told me everything I needed to know about that letter. But they weren't done. Because what came next was the part one hadn't anticipated, the part that still makes my hands tighten when I think about it. My mother leaned forward and said very quietly, very gently, Marcus, we're not trying to hurt you. We love you. But if you fight this, if you try to enforce whatever Whitmore has, it will destroy this family. You will lose your father. You will lose your brother. You will be alone. She let that land. Then she added, Is that what you want? Your grandfather's money and no family? I looked at my father. He was looking at the floor. He couldn't look at me. That told me something too. I need some air, I said. I stood up, walked to the back porch, stood in the cold for a full minute, looking at the yard my grandfather had helped my parents plant 15 years ago, the oak tree he'd selected himself, the stone path along the fence line he'd spent a weekend laying with my father. My phone buzzed. It was a text from a number I didn't recognize. I opened it. It was a photo. A document. Old letterhead, my grandfather's personal stationery. The letter they'd mentioned, the one establishing prior intent. I don't know how it ended up on my phone. I can only assume someone had shown Colton and he'd photographed it and sent it to the wrong person by mistake. I zoomed in. I read it. And then I read it again because I needed to be sure. 'Cause the handwriting was wrong. I had dozens of letters from my grandfather. Birthday cards. Notes tucked into books he'd lent me. A letter he'd written when I graduated college that I'd kept in a box in my closet. I knew his handwriting. This wasn't it. I went back inside. I sat back down in my chair. I looked at my mother, my father, my uncle, my aunt, all of them watching me with those carefully arranged expressions, and I said, I'd like to take a few days before we make any decisions. Is that okay? My mother's face softened with what looked like relief. Of course, she said. Of course. Take all the time you need. That night I photographed the text on my phone and sent it to Veronica Hall. Her response came back within the hour. This is significant. Can you scan and send at higher resolution? And I need you to bring me every handwriting sample from your grandfather you have access to. I spent the next morning scanning every card, note, and letter I'd ever received from Elias Ellery. Birthday cards. Holiday notes. The graduation letter. A handwritten recipe he'd given me once for his mother's pie crust that I'd kept for no rational reason other than that it was in his handwriting and felt like something I should hold on to. I drove them to Veronica's office in person. She had already been in contact with a forensic document examiner, someone her firm used regularly for exactly these situations. If this letter is fabricated, Veronica said, it's not just a civil matter. This crosses into fraud. I know, I said. Do you want to push on that? She asked. She wasn't steering me. She was genuinely asking. I thought about my father looking at the floor, about Colton's truck in the driveway, about my mother's perfume and the speech about losing my family. I want to do this correctly, I said. I want the truth to be what wins. Not my anger. Veronica nodded slowly. That's the right call. And it'll be more effective, frankly. Meanwhile, Gerald Whitmore had been doing his own work. He'd filed the trust for probate in a manner that, he explained, created a very specific legal sequence. Any challenge would have to clear multiple procedural hurdles before it could even be considered. Cognitive evaluation was already submitted as supplemental documentation. The witnesses were already on record. Clarence's written statement was already part of the file. My grandfather had built a wall. I hadn't understood until now just how carefully he'd built it. And there was one more thing Gerald revealed in our call that week. Something he said my grandfather had specifically asked him to hold until a challenge was formally threatened. A letter. A real one. In Elias Ellery's actual handwriting, written 8 months before his death, addressed to any court or family member who questioned his decisions. It was 3 pages long. Gerald read me one paragraph over the phone and I had to put my hand over my mouth to hold it together. I have been patient and deliberate. I have watched my family carefully for many years. I have seen who shows up and who stays away. I have seen who values money and who values people. This trust is not a punishment. It is simply an accurate reflection of what I observed. I sat in my car in the parking garage outside Gerald's building for 20 minutes before I could drive. Gerald called a formal estate meeting for a Thursday in March. It was required, a procedural step in the probate process where all named and potentially interested parties were notified and invited to attend. My family received their letters the week before. Gerald's office sent them by certified mail, which meant each of them had to physically sign for the envelope. My mother texted me after she received hers. "What is this about?" I said, "Standard process. We'll all find out together." Darren called twice. I let both calls go to voicemail. The night before the meeting, I had dinner with Dana. I'd kept her partially informed. She knew there was an estate dispute, knew it was getting complicated. I hadn't told her the full scope because I hadn't wanted to burden her with something that might have resolved itself quietly. It was not going to resolve itself quietly. She held my hand across the table and said, "Whatever happens tomorrow, you did the right things. You let the truth do the work. That matters." I don't know if she knew how much I needed to hear that. I barely slept. I arrived at Whitmore and Associates at 8:55 for a 9 o'clock meeting. Gerald met me at the elevator, looked at me carefully and said, "Are you ready?" "Yes," I said. He nodded. They all arrived together. Your parents, your uncle and aunt, your brother. They have their attorney with them, a man named Pritchard. He's aggressive but not particularly skilled in estate matters. I know his work. "Okay," I said. "Marcus." He paused. "Your grandfather wanted you to have one specific piece of information before we walked in. He asked me to tell you this morning before the meeting." He adjusted his glasses. He said, "Tell Marcus I was never prouder of him than when he chose to be a decent person in a family that didn't always model it." I looked at the ceiling of that hallway for a moment. Then I straightened my jacket. "Let's go in," I said. Conference room was exactly as I remembered it. Long table, neutral walls, morning light through partially closed blinds. My mother looked up when I walked in and gave me a smile that didn't make it to her eyes. Colton nodded. Darren had his arms crossed. Their attorney, Pritchard, was a thick-set man in a gray suit who radiated the particular confidence of someone who hasn't lost yet. Gerald took his place at the head of the table. He opened a folder. And the room got very quiet. "I'd like to begin," Gerald said, "by acknowledging that this is an emotional situation for everyone present. What I'm going to share today is factual, documented, and legally binding. I'm asking that everyone allow the process to proceed before responding." Pritchard, the opposing attorney, was already leaning forward slightly, preparing to object. Gerald didn't give him the opening. The trust established by Elias Ellery names Marcus Ellery as primary beneficiary. 60% of the estate, which has been appraised at $4.3 million, is designated for him. The remaining 40% is divided between 2 charitable organizations named in the original document. He slid a copy of the trust across to Pritchard. "You'll find the amendment on page 11. It was executed 18 months ago, properly witnessed and notarized. The witnesses are listed by name and contact information on page 14. Pritchard flipped to page 11. His expression didn't change, but I saw his jaw tighten fractionally. My mother looked at my father. He was looking at the table. That's the first one, I thought. Watch the reactions. Gerald let the room sit with that for exactly long enough. Then he continued. A motion was filed earlier this month by the firm of Pritchard and Associates, alleging that Elias Ellery lacked testamentary capacity at the time the amendment was executed. Gerald paused. In anticipation of such a challenge, and I want to be precise here, in anticipation because Mr. Ellery specifically foresaw that this claim might be made, he arranged for a comprehensive neurological and cognitive evaluation to be conducted 6 months before his death, by a licensed neuropsychologist, Dr. Rachel Toma, who is on faculty at University Medical Center. He slid a second document across. The evaluation found no impairment, no dementia, no cognitive decline, no medication-induced decision-making compromise. Dr. Toma is prepared to testify to this in court. Darren shifted in his seat. Patricia put her hand over her mouth. That's the second. Pritchard cleared his throat. One evaluation. There are 3, Gerald said. 3 independent evaluations, conducted at intervals over 8 months. All by physicians with no personal connection to the Ellery family. All reaching the same conclusion. He slid 3 documents across simultaneously. The sound of paper on that table felt enormous in the quiet room. My mother's hand was pressed flat on the table in front of her. I watched her knuckles. I also want to address, Gerald continued, with the measured calm of a man who had been doing this for 30 years, a letter that was apparently presented to members of this family as evidence of Elias Ellery's prior intent to distribute his estate equally among his grandchildren. He let that sit. Pritchard's chin came up slightly. We have documentation. So do we, Gerald said. He slid a folder across to Veronica Hall, who had been sitting quietly beside me. She opened it and passed documents to Pritchard without comment. That folder contains a forensic handwriting analysis, conducted by Dr. Patricia Waverly, who has testified as an expert witness in over 200 cases in this state, comparing the letter your firm submitted with authenticated samples of Elias Ellery's handwriting spanning 4 decades. Gerald looked at Pritchard directly. The letter is not in Elias Ellery's handwriting. Dr. Waverly's finding is unambiguous. The letter was not written by him. Silence. Real silence. Kind that doesn't just mean no one is talking. Kind that means no one can figure out what to say. Tricia made a sound that was somewhere between a breath and a word. Darren turned to Pritchard. Pritchard's confident posture had changed in a way that was subtle but visible if you were watching, which I was. He looked like a man reviewing all of his options simultaneously and finding each of them significantly worse than he'd expected. And finally, Gerald said, and his voice was still completely calm, still completely measured, because he had been building to this and he knew exactly what it would do to the room. Elias Ellery, in the months before his death, wrote a letter, in his own hand, addressed specifically to any party who might challenge his estate decisions. He gave it to my office with instructions to present it in exactly this context. He reached into the folder and produced a document in a clear sleeve, 3 handwritten pages on Elias Ellery's personal stationery, in handwriting I knew in my bones. I will read the relevant portions. Gerald read. He read the paragraph about patience and observation, about who shows up and who stays away, about money and people. He read a passage about Marcus, my name in my grandfather's handwriting, that described a kid who came early to help with meals and stayed late to listen, who never once asked what he was going to receive, who treated Elias like a person, not an asset. He read a final passage where my grandfather, clearly and in writing, expressed that he had made his choices with a clear mind, a full heart, and without any pressure or influence from anyone. I want it known, Gerald read, voice steady, that I am leaving my estate as I have designated it because I believe in the man Marcus has become, and because I believe he will do something worthwhile with what I've built. That is my hope. That is my final wish. That is my right as the man who earned every dollar of it. Gerald set the document down. He looked at the room. My mother was crying. Not the soft, dignified kind. The other kind. Kind that comes out when something you've been telling yourself starts to crack. Colton was staring at the far wall. Darren was whispering something to Pritchard. Pritchard was shaking his head. The silence lasted longer than I expected. It's one thing to imagine a moment like this, to run it through your head at 3 a.m, to think about all the ways it might play out. It's another thing entirely to be sitting inside it, to watch the faces of people you've known your whole life process something they believed was impossible. Pritchard leaned toward Darren and said something quiet that I couldn't hear. Darren's expression shifted, not into anger exactly, but into something deflated. Something that had been holding its shape for a long time and was now releasing. I think, Pritchard said finally at a normal volume, my clients would benefit from a moment to confer privately. Of course, Gerald said. They were gone for 11 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on the wall. When Darren and Pritchard returned, my parents and aunt came back too. The arrangement of the room felt different now, less like a confrontation, more like a site where something had already happened and everyone was still assessing the damage. We're withdrawing the challenge, Pritchard said. Clean. Simple. No preamble. Gerald nodded. Made a note on his legal pad. I'll need that in writing, he said, by end of business Friday. You'll have it, Pritchard said. He began gathering his papers. He was efficient about it. Professional. Not defeated exactly, more like recalibrated. He'd read the room correctly. The fight wasn't winnable. That was all this was to him. But it wasn't all it was to me. After Pritchard was done gathering his papers, after he said a brief word to Darren and left the room, there was a moment where it was just family. Gerald stepped out to give us the room, he was thoughtful like that. And I sat across from my parents. My father still hadn't looked at me directly. My mother's eyes were still red. Colton was looking at his hands. I want to say something, I said. And I'm not saying it to hurt anyone. Nobody spoke. I don't think any of you are bad people, I said. I think you got scared. I think when something unexpected happened, you chose a way of handling it that wasn't right. And I think somewhere probably you know that. My father looked up. Finally. His eyes were dry, but something in them was broken in a way I'd never seen before. Marcus, he started. You don't need to explain right now, I said. I'm not asking for an explanation. I'm just saying what I know. I stood up. I loved Grandpa too, I said. Whatever you think about me or this process, I loved him. This isn't something I wanted. Something he chose. And I'm going to try to honor it the way he would have wanted. I buttoned my jacket. I left the room. There's a version of this story where I walked out of that conference room feeling triumphant, vindicated. Like the credits were rolling and the music was swelling and I'd finally gotten everything I deserved. That's not what it felt like. What it felt like was tired. And sad. And complicated in ways I hadn't fully anticipated. 'Cause the truth is, and I've had a lot of time to sit with this, winning something like this doesn't actually give you back what was taken. Doesn't return the years of being the afterthought. Doesn't fix the Sunday dinners or the Applebee's graduation or all the times my mother looked at me and saw someone she couldn't quite be proud of. Doesn't make your father able to look you in the eye. The money was real. The legal outcome was real. My grandfather's love, expressed so deliberately and documented so carefully, was profoundly real. But none of it repaired what was broken in my family. I had to make peace with that. Took a while. What I decided, slowly and with a lot of conversations with Dana and my therapist and occasional late nights just thinking, was that I wasn't going to use what I'd inherited as a weapon. I wasn't going to cut people off with cruelty. I wasn't going to make pronouncements or send messages or engineer further public humiliations. I was going to live my life. I honored my grandfather's charitable bequests to the letter. I spent real time understanding what organizations he'd chosen and why: a literacy program for underprivileged kids, a veterans support foundation. I made additional contributions beyond what the trust required because those were causes he'd cared about and I wanted to care about them too. I set boundaries with my family. Not walls, boundaries. I told my parents in a calm and private conversation that I was willing to maintain a relationship, but that it would require honesty and a different kind of respect than I'd received. That I wasn't interested in pretending nothing had happened. That I also wasn't interested in relitigating everything forever. My father cried during that conversation. It was the first time I'd ever seen him cry. I didn't know what to do with that. I still don't fully. But I didn't close the door. Grandpa Elias had spent his life building something. Not just money, a standard. A way of being in the world that said, pay attention to the people around you. Reward integrity. Believe in the ones who show up. He tried to teach that to his son, and somewhere along the way, his son had gotten lost. But he'd seen it in me, apparently. He'd held on to that. I was gonna try to be worth the seeing. It's been 14 months since that morning in Gerald Whitmore's conference room. Here's what happened in the aftermath. Pritchard's written withdrawal arrived by end of business Friday, as promised. Clean, no conditions, exactly what Gerald requested. The estate closed without further legal action 6 weeks later. My Uncle Darren's business, the one that had been struggling, filed for bankruptcy protection 8 months after the estate settled. I heard about it through my cousin Tyler, who had quietly reached out to me about 3 months after the meeting, not to ask for anything, just to say he was sorry for how things had gone. He's 21 now. He's in culinary school and seems, honestly, happier than I've ever seen him. We've had coffee twice. I like him. Aunt Patricia stopped speaking to my mother after it came out, and it did come out inside the family the way things always do, that the letter they'd submitted was not in my grandfather's handwriting. I don't know the full details of that conversation. I don't need to. My mother and I talk occasionally. It's different than before. Less performance, more silence, but an honest silence. She sent me a card on my birthday. Inside it she'd written, I know I didn't get everything right. I'm still your mother. I kept it. I haven't decided what I think about it yet. My father and I have had 3 real conversations. Longer than any we'd had in years. He told me in the last one that Elias had called him once, a month before he died, and told him that Marcus was going to be okay and that he hoped Robert would find a way to see that. My father didn't know what to make of it then. He said he thought about it a lot now. I bought a house. Not because having a house makes you a successful person, but because it's something I'd wanted for a long time and put off because something in me always felt like I had to earn the right to want things. My grandfather's gift, not just the money but the clarity of being seen, gave me permission in some way to take up more space in my own life. Dana and I got engaged in November. Quiet dinner, just us, a ring I'd picked out myself. She said yes before I finished the sentence. I go to the cemetery when I can. I don't always say anything. Sometimes I just sit near the headstone for a while. The inscription is simple, his name, his dates, and below that, at his own request, he paid attention. He did. I'm trying to. If you've made it to the end of this, thank you. That means a lot. But before you go, I want to ask you something. Have you ever been in a situation where someone you love revealed themselves to be something different than you believed? Where a family dynamic you'd always accepted turned out to be something you had to consciously walk away from? Or maybe you've been the one who saw something coming and chose to prepare quietly instead of fighting loudly. Drop it in the comments. Tell me what you would have done. Tell me what you did do. This community has shown me over and over that these stories are more universal than they look from the outside, and I know there are people watching this right now who are in the middle of their own version of it. You're not alone in that. And if you haven't subscribed yet, hit the button. More stories are coming. And if this one moved you, share it. Someone out there might need to hear it today.